In the summer of 1872, Dwight L. Moody returned to North America with a full enough doctrinal kit bag. We know him as America's biggest evangelist revivalist of the last quarter of the 19th century. But not just yet. He did not come home in 1871 and turn his enriched faith into a message for the New World. In fact, he did not know how. He had one big piece of praxis to master, big crowd revivalism, and for that, he went back to his finishing school, the British Isles. The crucial point is that, despite the later celebration of Moody in his home country as having brought American evangelicalism to the British Isles, the exact opposite was true. Moody had experimented with the methods of urban evangelicalism while in the United Kingdom, had created, tested, and perfected his techniques, and he brought home to the United States a new portfolio of techniques for dealing with cities. In June 1873, in another of his strong-willed moves, Moody traveled to the United Kingdom to conduct a series of urban revivals. He reckoned on at most 3 months in northern England and Scotland, and then he would return to the United States and perhaps take up revivalism in America. In fact, he was gone from June 1873 until August 1875, and became an evangelist in North America only after this final stint of pastoral apprenticeship abroad. Moody's tour of 1873 to 1875 was a long practicum in which Moody learned from experience in the world's most advanced industrial economy the modes and methods that would work in the northern portions of North America, the Great Lakes Basin and hinterlands, that were themselves becoming urban and industrial. Thus, Moody's 1873 to 1875 tour is sensibly considered as the final stage of his transforming himself from life as a Midwestern evangelical activist into a transnational evangelical figure. During his 1872 UK visit, Moody had cultivated heavy players, British, Irish, and visiting Americans, and they engaged in dream talks about a campaign. I met him in London in 1872, and with him spent several days at Booterstown, Willow Park, Dublin, with Henry Bewley, a sturdy Calvinist, a Plymouth brother who was the pocketbook and promoter of the Dublin Tract Society, recalled John H. Vincent, 1832 to 1920, a leading Chicago Methodist minister, and on his way to being the co-founder and chancellor of the Chautauqua Institution. In Mr. Bewley's fine mansion, several of us spent 3 days in projecting plans for Mr. Moody's evangelistic work. The Plymouth Brethren dominated. Further, Theodore L. Cuyler, 1822 to 1909, pastor of the largest Presbyterian congregation in the United States, met Moody in London during the 1872 trip. They got along. One day, coming into my room, he said, "They wish me to come over here and preach in England." I urged him to do so, for I said, "These English people are the best people to preach to in the world." Moody said, "I will go home, secure somebody to sing, and come over and make the experiment." The experiment, perfect term, was personal for Moody. Could he go to a foreign country and change careers, and also collective? Potentially, the experiment could answer the question that overhung evangelicalism in the Anglosphere in the second half of the 19th century. Namely, was it possible to conduct evangelism successfully in a society that was moving quickly towards becoming urban and industrial, becoming what at one time was called modernized? Considered in terms of those socio-economic variables, Great Britain was the future, the predictor of what the United States would become. Great Britain, excluding Ireland, crossed over the urban-rural line in 1851. More than half the population lived in towns or cities. The United States did not go over that threshold until the census of 1920. These residential data are the litmus numbers, for they imply certain causal factors and consequences that urban-dominated cultures shared in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Industrial production, shouldering aside handicrafts and farm production as the dominant economic forms. Rapid population growth. The creation of an urban proletariat. Spasms of social disorder. Some of it a direct response to extreme poverty, but equally often the result of lower middle classes, rising in education and economic resources, pushing for increased democratization of the political process. And above all, a constant rasping friction of capital versus labor. The one portion of North America that most resembled Great Britain in these matters was the area that we have been dealing with in this book as a clearly defined and well-documented field of religious endeavor, the Great Lakes Basin and its contiguous hinterland, a block that can be defined by running a connecting line from Montreal to Toronto to Chicago to St. Louis to Philadelphia to New York and Boston, and back to Montreal. If Dwight L. Moody could learn from his British experiment the tricks and tactics for a successful revival campaign in the Old Country, he would unlock the modes and methods for revivals in the big cities of the North in the United States and Canada. The playbook would be good for at least the rest of the century, and probably a bit longer. The public aspects of Moody's 1873 to 1875 mission in the British Isles are well documented, and we can take them as given. In these years, some things he got right and repeated them later across the Atlantic, some things he got wrong and subsequently avoided them. Bluntly, the mission started out as a massive cock-up and only gradually moved to competence, and then, as a small snowslide turning into an avalanche, Moody's learning quickly became a stop-press triumph. Moody and his soon-to-be legendary musical sideman, Ira D. Sankey, 1840 to 1908, arrived with nearly empty pockets, save $500 purse money John V. Farwell had given to Mrs. Moody. The group barely kept afloat. Mrs. Moody and children were put up by her relatives in London. Moody had done no planning for his work, and no advance men had arranged anything. Their first few meetings in late June 1873 were almost monastic. 50 people present in the initial meeting in a Baptist chapel, and at York, 6 people in the first noonday prayer meeting at the YMCA. At first, Moody was distrusted and denounced by local clergy, particularly in Scotland, who saw this brazen drop-in as, at minimum, a threat. Moody quickly acquired some British helpers to make contact and book his appearances, and he quickly realized that he had to bring the local Protestant clergy on side. This was tricky, and if he could not gain their active cooperation, he tried to be as inoffensive as possible, so that at least the clerics were not obstructive. One basic move was to have a private meeting with local ministers at the start of his visit to a city, and to ask for advice. He avoided any hint of being an authority. He was, he said, just a stranger in your midst, a brother in the Lord, and if I speak somewhat strangely, and at times roughly, I hope for your prayers and help. Just an innocent American businessman, working for the Lord. Moody was treading a tight line. He was pan-denominational, which meant he could not veer too closely to the posture and praxis of any institutional group. At the same time, he had to avoid any suggestion that he was involved with a separationist sect, especially one that was run by laymen and that rejected any special power being obtained through ordination. which is why, though he kept his close contacts with the Open Brethren, he did so discreetly. As an intuitive master salesman, Moody knew that in any situation there are things that will kill the sale. In Christian revival work, the biggest hindrance to success is to talk about theology when one is actually trying to sell religion. That tactical reality fit Moody's own personality and his bundle of doctrines, for he instinctively talked in terms of experiencing true belief, not reasoning about it. Early on in his work in Scotland, he came close to being pinched on the matter of election and predestination. He talked his way out of the problem by telling reporters that he was just passing through Scotland and that he'd never been involved in a newspaper controversy and he did not want to start now. Since his revival sermons were mostly anecdotal, even when the anecdotes were modernized retellings of Bible stories, he largely escaped being pinned into corners by denominational interests. Moody became adept at using side services as structural supports for the central preaching events. He did prayer meetings exceedingly well, and he took over the concept of Bible readings from his brethren mentors. He reached the biggest numbers in his main services, but for many of his followers who already were committed evangelicals, these scripture services were the most reassuring portion of his work. These Bible readings consist in a careful and systematic grouping of scripture texts, all relating to a single central truth, which by this method is vividly impressed upon mind and heart. After singing and prayer, the congregation take their Bibles, and the leader reads the list of texts which he expects to use, asking after each one, "Who will read this out when I call for it?" Or the text may be written out, or chapter and verse noted on a piece of paper, and the slips distributed to those who are to read them, if preferred. This was a stripped-down version of the Bible study techniques Moody had learned from the Brethren in his earlier trips to the British Isles and had practiced with some success in Chicago. The difference was that the full-spectrum Bible readings of the Brethren were usually held in small groups of the faithful who knew each other well, and their scriptures even better, so that very complex interpretative matters often were discussed in a forum that was quite free-flowing. In Moody's usage, the entire list of selected scriptures being thus assigned to persons in the congregation, the exercise opens by calling for the text first in order. The one who has taken it reads it aloud, and the leader explains, illustrates, and enforces it briefly, and then calls for the next. Sometimes one person is appointed beforehand to find and read the texts as they are called for, and sometimes the leader reads them, asking all the congregation to turn to them and read them. Thus, the Lord is brought into the congregation to speak for himself. No wonder he honors such a use of his word. Perhaps these readings were a little stiff, but as a supplement and support for the big auditorium revival services, the smaller group Bible readings and the prayer meetings for laypersons, like the advisory sessions with local pastors, were canny. Moody in the 1873 to 1875 campaign learned some useful things about managing the press, mostly how to keep its members tame. Particularly useful was Robert Cope Morgan of the publishing house Morgan & Scott in London, whom Moody had cultivated during his 1872 UK visit. Among the firm's holdings was The Christian, a bi-weekly. It had previously been named The Revival, and that placed it firmly in the warm evangelical camp. As editor, Morgan plumped for Moody during those early, almost pathetic weeks in 1873, and covered his subsequent work closely and sympathetically. In 1874, Morgan went so far as to send free copies of certain issues of the paper to all evangelical ministers in the British Isles, and later, regularly to all such pastors in London. Obviously, Moody benefited greatly, and it was a two-way street. The firm of Morgan & Scott soon gained the UK publishing rights to the immensely profitable Moody and Sankey hymn book. On a more general level, Moody was widely, almost lasciviously, newspaper-friendly. As he began to be somewhat well-known, he quickly provided special accommodation at his services for shorthand reporters. He privately thanked reporters for minimizing his mistakes and deleting at least some of his mixed metaphors. Moody was a businessman, and he knew how to make deals, both spoken and implicit. Thus, he soon learned to make reporters' lives easier by sending them accounts of what he wanted them to know about his mission thus far, and so self-promotion was turned into seemingly reliable news stories. Moody worked out a few new urban big-meeting tactics. The inquiry room was the chief innovation, and even that was not entirely new. But mostly he did what a go-ahead industrialist would do for his product: plan its production carefully, advertise, work the press, make as few enemies as possible, and supplement big production events with more intimate support shows. He returned to North America in August 1875 with a skill set unmatched in North American evangelical circles. The British Isles had taught him how mass evangelism could be successfully conducted in urban industrial settings. He set about a 5-year period of mass evangelism in the United States that drew numbers never before seen, and all this while carrying on other projects. Bruce Evanson puts it well. Moody had all but formulated a campaign structure that he would follow successfully for a quarter of a century on both sides of the Atlantic. All Moody's hard-learned managerial techniques were necessary. Still, the component that cannot be put into an analytic category is Moody's own ability to do wholesale evangelizing. What can one say about someone with a big enough voice to preach to 30,000 people at once, as in the Crystal Palace, London, in the spring of 1875, and to do so not as an orator, but seemingly just talking in stories and Bible verses about a life-deciding decision his listeners are about to make? The man was a perplexing but exceeding well-wrought miracle. David Bebbington was right. The American evangelicalism that reigned in the last full quarter century of the Victorian era is best understood as not being merely national, but widely transnational. Moody is so large a figure that he deserves the direct attention we have given him, but he was also an emblem of an extraordinary degree of interplay within the Anglosphere. For the Gilded Age, the warm portion of evangelicalism has to be broken out of the silo of American religious historiography. This is not an easy task, and what holds for Gilded Age revivalism is an even more pressing brief: to chronicle and analyze the development of American apocalyptic evangelicalism as a piece of a larger, world-changing phenomenon: the diaspora of Christianity during the second half of the Victorian era.